Well, hello, and a very warm welcome back to the Andrew Eborn Show with me, Andrew Eborn. And I'm delighted that my wonderful new guest, back by popular demand, is Dr. George Szamuely. How are you, George?
I'm good. How are you, Andrew?
It is so good to see you, and we're surviving,
That's
is the honest answer in this lead up to Christmas. What I love about having you on the program is that we can unpack world events and put them into historical context. So, what I want to do is I want to start with Ukraine, because obviously developments happening all of the time there. Let's start by looking at the historical context of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Talk us through it.
well. I mean, to very roughly speaking, I mean, of course, Ukraine and Russia are very close historically, culturally, by means of their religious faith, um, and it had they both countries had been part of the Russian Empire, and then they were both part of the Soviet Union. Um, at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine had pledged that it would maintain neutrality. It would not join any military alliance. And that was more or less was adhered to through the 1990s. But what changed was the Orange Revolution in 2004. I don't know if you recall, where Viktor Yanukovych had won the election. It was a two-round election, one election, but as often happens with these color revolutions, in came the West, claiming election fraud, election fraud, election fraud. So they reran the election, and lo and behold, Yanukovych lost, and it was Viktor Yushchenko, who was very much the West's man, was became president. And from that moment on, Ukraine really explicitly moved towards NATO membership and EU membership. So it was very, very much a change in policy from 1991. But Ukraine being a very divided country, because if you just consider the history just of modern Ukraine, you had a large chunk of Russia that had been separated from Russia and shoved into Ukraine. This was part of the Bolsheviks' policy under Lenin of essentially creating other non-Russian nationalities, because Russia was obviously the biggest, most powerful nation among the nations of the USSR. So the Bolsheviks wanted to downgrade Russian nationalism, and contrariwise, they sought to elevate every other non-Russian nationality. So that's why they took a piece of Russia, which the part that we now know as the Donbass, and inserted it into Ukraine. Now, these people are essentially Russian speakers. They identify as Russian, and we're always going to be a problem with the western part of Ukraine, parts of which had also been added to Ukraine by successive Bolshevik leaders. So, for instance, after World War II, territory that had been a part of Poland was now added to Ukraine. Territory that had been part of Romania was now added to Ukraine, as was territory that had been a part of Hungary. So it was a very diverse population. But the problem was that once the Ukrainian government under Yushchenko after the Orange Revolution made its move towards the West and to become a part of NATO and the Western system of alliances, then this naturally led to a revolt on the part of the people in the East, those who identified themselves as Russian. Now, Viktor Yanukovych, we talked about, who had won the 2004 election, but had been robbed of his the presidency. He ran it for the presidency again in 2010, and his platform was that basically he was going to enact laws, change the constitution, essentially to go back to the status quo ante, which is that Ukraine will be neutral. Ukraine will not pursue membership of NATO. And 2010, they have another election. Yanukovych wins, and he does exactly as he promised, which is that he passes legislation saying Ukraine will be neutral, Ukraine will not join any military alliances, and therefore we're not going to pursue any longer the membership of NATO. Well, this didn't sit well with NATO. These kinds of declarations never did. And of course, they seized the opportunity of the winter of 2013 and 2014 to try to overthrow Viktor Yanukovych. And the immediate cause of that had been that Yanukovych, had been involved in the Union to sign an association agreement between Ukraine and the EU. And then Yanukovych then said, well, this is not a good deal. Let's postpone the signature. And then out came Rent-A-Mob, the rioting in the streets and so on. And that was the Maidan. And basically there was a coup that overthrew the legally elected legitimate government of Viktor Yanukovych. And the people who had lost the election, who had lost the 2010 election, now came to the fore, and they absolutely rushed to pursue NATO membership. And this really set the stage for the increasingly hostile clash between Russia and Ukraine, because we then had those parts of the Ukraine that we're talking about, the Donbass, which simply didn't accept the overthrow of Yanukovych. You wouldn't. I mean, if you have a democratically election and you have a leader who is democratically elected and then he's overthrown, then those territories that had voted overwhelmingly for that leader are going to revolt and say, we don't accept the coup. This was the man we had voted for, and this is the second time you've come along and robbed him of the presidency. You did this at the Orange Revolution in 2004, and now you've done this again in 2014, and so they revolted, and then then when the government in Kiev sought to crush the revolt, Russia came in, with some limited help, and they signed an agreement, two agreements, the Minsk I, 2014, and then Minsk II, 2015. The gist of it was that Ukraine would change the constitution to give special status to the Donbass. And then when that's done, then whatever Russian forces are in Ukraine will withdraw. Well, Ukraine never changed the constitution. And it was clear that with all the NATO help that was being poured into Ukraine from 2014 on, that the plan was, this was the NATO Kiev plan, was to take the Donbass by force, to just crush the rebellion, push the Russians out, and then it'll just be a fait accompli. Very similar to what Croatia did in 1995 when it brought to an end the sort of the Serb revolt against the kind of the neo-fascist government in Zagreb that just simply moved in again with NATO help and just crushed the Serbs. That was 1995. Something like that was being planned in Ukraine, and then Russia had decided to anticipate this, and we launched a special military operation in February of 2022. So anyway, that's a kind of brief
very helpful
outline of a complicated history.
No, I think it's so important with these things because people lose sight of the historical context. And just briefly to add into that, talk to me about the rise of Zelensky.
Well, Zelensky is a kind of an unusual case because he was a comedian and an entertainer, and after the overthrow of Yanukovych, the president was elected, Piero Poroshenko, who was a very, very wealthy man, one of the richest men in Ukraine. He was a kind of chocolate baron. That's his thing. It was, manufacturing chocolates. Incidentally, the manufacture took place inside of Russia. Um, and he actually had campaigned on trying to improve relations with Russia, but didn't really do anything very much about it. And he became extremely unpopular by 2019 when they had the election. And then out of nowhere, this strange figure, this comedian, who's who had become a big kind of a television star by being the star of a television series in which he played a comedian who became a
Right.
president.
Yes.
So it was like this was the comedy show that he plays a comedian who becomes a president, and then lo and behold, reality imitates art, and he becomes the comedian who becomes a president. Now, he had a lot of wealthy backers, and particularly some very rather sinister Ukrainian oligarchs who bankrolled him. This is Igor Kolomoisky, and who was also bankrolling, Azov, these neo-Nazi groupings in Ukraine. So he bankrolls them, and then he bankrolls this person who was clearly a Jew, but not a practicing, not religious, and not somebody who had never really identified as a Jew, but nonetheless he was a Jew. So he supports Zelensky. And Zelensky also campaigns very much like Poroshenko had in 2014 as somebody who is going to bring peace. Right. He's going to try to pursue reconciliation with the people in the Donbass. He's going to pursue reconciliation with Russia. And he won overwhelmingly. I mean, because I think that's what Ukrainians wanted in 2019. But once he got in, he made very little effort in doing so. And even if he had wanted to pursue reconciliation, it was clear that there were very powerful forces in Ukraine who would not accept this, and in fact, they would just kill him without the question if he really went down that path. And so, after a few opening weeks in which he seemed to be serious about bringing the conflict in Ukraine to an end, he just went along with this the path of exacerbating the conflict with Russia, and then of course what really triggered things. So that's 2019. Then 2021, January 2021, Biden becomes president. Now Biden was the whole Biden family was very entangled with post-2014 Ukraine. I mean, we know about Hunter Biden, who moved in very quickly to Ukraine to make a lot of money. He got this position as a director of this gas company, Burisma, even though Hunter Biden had no background in gas, energy, no background in Russia or Ukraine, didn't speak any of the languages. He never even been to Ukraine, but he got this position on Burisma. And so the whole Biden family, and indeed a number of figures within the Democratic Party, became very entangled with Ukraine, the sort of post-2014 Ukraine. So if you look at trace what was going on through 2021, in the sort of the first year of the Biden administration, it was clear that they were determined to push for Ukrainian membership of NATO. And I think sometime around, October of 2021, we had Lloyd Austin. He went to Ukraine, he went to Georgia, both of whom had been promised NATO membership in 2008. The kind of last, gasp of the George W. Bush administration, which was a total disaster. But his final disastrous act was to get NATO to commit itself to Georgian and Ukrainian membership. So Lloyd Austin goes there in October 2021, and he says, the road to NATO membership for Ukraine is open. And I think the Russians then saw this as that this is what the Biden administration is going to do. They're just going to absolutely push for Ukraine membership and present it as a fait accompli. That's it, done. There's nothing you can do to stop it. Ukraine will be a member tomorrow, and that's it. Thank you and goodbye. And I think that's what really forced the hand of the Russian leaders, because they said, hey, we only have a small window before we're presented with a fait accompli on Ukrainian membership of NATO. And that visit by Lloyd Austin in October 2021, I think almost certainly determined the fate of Ukraine.
Right. And people always focus on that. That's one of their missions, if you like, to become a NATO member. In a nutshell, George, why would Russia oppose it?
Well, what NATO has been doing since the end of the Cold War has been essentially scooping up every single country that not only borders Russia, but had been an ally of the Soviet Union. So you have the Warsaw Pact countries. So we had Hungary, we had Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania. Every single one of them had been scooped up within NATO. So this is already just, if you just think of those countries, that's already a major geopolitical shift against Russia. Hey, these countries were our allies, our military allies. Now they're members of a hostile military alliance. Because of course Russia does see NATO as hostile, and there's no two ways about it. Just read any missive that comes from NATO, it oozes hostility towards Russia. And then you had the Baltic states. Now the Baltic states, the three Baltic states, had been constituent republics of the USSR. So now three constituent republics of the USSR were also scooped up within NATO. And then in Romania, and then George W. Bush promises, and NATO, of course, promises NATO membership to Ukraine and to Georgia. That's two more former republics of the USSR. So that's a major, major geopolitical shift against Russia, and one which guarantees that Russia is surrounded by hostile, militarized states that belong to a hostile military alliance.
Right.
And of course, the Russians well knew that NATO was also planning to scoop up Finland and Sweden. So if you're looking at the map and you're the president of Russia and you're saying, wow, everywhere we look, from the north, right, all the way, west and going east, we are surrounded by NATO states.
Yeah.
And it's all happened very, very quickly. Cold War comes to an end, 1991. And suddenly, and here we are, 2021, when basically they were planning on moving Ukraine into NATO. That's within 30 years. They've ensured that we're surrounded by hostile states. And for Russia, obviously, which still suffers from the trauma of Barbarossa, the huge invasion of 1941. There's a feeling that we can't allow this. Now NATO says, well, that was Nazi Germany. We're peaceful, we're friendly, we're defensive. Well, the problem with that is that you can't say, well, I'm defensive, and all my intent is purely honorable and peace-loving and goodwill. It depends on how somebody else sees you. You're not the judge in your own case. How are you seen by someone else? And if somebody else says, yeah, but how defensive are you when you bombed our ally, Yugoslavia? You bombed it for 11 straight weeks. despite the fact that we kept pleading with you not to do it because we have a particular attachment to the Serbs, historical attachment to Serbs, and you told us to go shove it. So what kind of a defensive alliance are you? You went and bombed Libya. What kind of a defensive alliance are you? You know, neither Libya nor Yugoslavia posed any kind of a threat to NATO, and yet you went ahead and bombed it. And even the whole issue of expansion, if you're defensive, why are you expanding? You know, if you're defensive, you stay put. But when you're expanding, that doesn't sound defensive. And so NATO just goes on repeating like this mantra, whoa, we're defensive, we're defensive, we're defensive. Well, Russia doesn't see it as defensive. Hey, you've come right up to our doorstep. You're surrounding us, or wherever we go, we see NATO warships, we see NATO aircraft, we see NATO satellites. Everywhere we're surrounded by NATO. Don't give us this crap that you are defensive.
Yeah. So, I mean, really helpful, to, as I say, to understand the historical context of that. Things are changing all the time, and we get reports, even as we come in now, about this is like the worst atrocities that Russia's suffered since this whole conflict began. What is the current military situation on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, Russia is focused primarily on trying to gain as much territory within those 4 oblasts that Russia now claims are part of the Russian Federation. So these were 4 oblasts of Ukraine, but Russia, since I think September 2022, said no, they are part of the Russian Federation. That means that's Donetsk, Lugansk, which is the Donbass, but then also Kherson and Zaporozhye. So Russia is now trying to take up as much of that territory as possible. So we don't know exact numbers, but I think Lugansk is more or less 98% is in possession of the Russians. The Donetsk, I think maybe 60 to 65. Zaporozhye, maybe about 72%. Kherson, maybe about 60%. Well, what they're doing here is that they're trying to present facts on the ground. You know, so if you take as much territory as possible, then if there is to be some kind of a negotiations, peace conference, then you say, well, this is ours. You know, we got it. You know, if you want peace, you're just going to have to accept the realities on the ground. And clearly, what's going on now is everyone is in the waiting pattern on Trump. What is Trump going to do? Because Trump takes over in about a month, and he has said that he's going to make a serious effort to bring this war to an end. Now, the negotiated outcome that Trump would probably go for, and we're getting outlines of that, is basically you freeze the conflict in place on the current lines of contact. NATO membership for Ukraine is just put on the back burner. It's just it's not something we're going to talk about now. In the meantime, Trump is going to pour in arms and shells, tanks, everything. You name it, whatever America has in its armory, whatever Europe has in its armory, they're going to pour it into Ukraine. Now, I don't think that's such a great deal for the Russians, but the Russians may just think that, look, at least the war's come to an end. We've acquired this additional territory. Why antagonize Trump? At least Trump is making a good faith effort to end the fighting in a way that Biden didn't do, in the way that NATO didn't do for the past 3 years. Trump at least is prepared to end the fighting, and that's something is very different. Trump's tone when talking about Ukraine is very different from the tone of the Biden administration. Trump's tone is that this has to come to an end, and that hasn't been the tone of the Biden administration. The Biden administration was that Ukraine must win. We have to do whatever we can to ensure Ukraine wins, and this is repeated ad nauseum by all the NATO leaders in Europe. Oh, we have to do what we can for Ukraine, but Trump is very different. Trump is saying, no, we have to end this. Now, that a frozen conflict is not is not great. I mean, I think that it doesn't stay frozen forever.
Right, and that's
It
the
gives you
problem, isn't
it's a
it? Yeah.
breathing room, but chances are it's going to start up again in 5, 10, 15 years.
Yes. So, and I think that's the thing. You and I have spoken about this beforehand. We do feel as though the world should be a safer place when Trump comes in and resolves some of these conflicts. But as you say, if it's just frozen, there are
Right.
these risks for the future. What is going to be the best solution? If we were to look at that now, what's the best solution for the resolution of the conflict?
Well, my own feeling would be the best solution is to get rid of the people who are in charge in Kiev, a kind of regime change, because that's really Russia's problem. Russia's problem is Ukraine becoming entangled very deeply with NATO, even if NATO membership de jure is postponed for however many years. De facto, Ukraine will be a member of NATO. In other words, there'll be NATO everywhere. Wherever you turn, there'll be NATO command centers. There'll be NATO artillery. NATO military equipment. So that's the problem for Russia. So if you just freeze the conflict. Okay, when there's no people aren't getting killed anymore. You've acquired new territory. This whatever the new territory you've acquired, it becomes integrated within the Russian Federation, and then you make sure, okay, well, Ukraine can't really get this back. However, knowing NATO, they're going to start this up again. That's it's just in the way of NATO. NATO has to justify itself. It has to justify its continued existence and expansion, and therefore it's in NATO's interest to aggravate conflict with Russia, and that's what it's going to do. That's why it's going to continue arming Ukraine and staging all kinds of provocative incidents on the line of contact between NATO and Russia inside Ukraine, so that the public gets used to the idea that some kind of a showdown, final showdown between Russia and NATO is inevitable. I think that's the most likely that's going to happen. But ideally, if Trump were more daring and more imaginative, he could think about holding some kind of a global peace conference and saying, look, I mean, we need to figure out some way of a kind of a modus vivendi between Russia and NATO, going back to the Helsinki model, the Helsinki Security Conference of 1975, whereby both sides recognize the security needs of the other and go out of their way to ensure that they don't do anything that antagonizes or provokes conflict with the other, which is what they did at Helsinki.
Yeah, and certainly Trump would want some sort of legacy apart from
Right, exactly.
solving the conflict rather
Exactly.
than
I
just
think
freezing it.
absolutely. I think Trump would be tempted. I mean, if by such a thing, then we know he'd like to have the Nobel Peace Prize. So if he could do this, and the Russians have always pushed for this,
Yes.
some kind of some global peace conference. So Trump would be, but then you have to look at the people around Trump, and they would say, "Hey, if you hold a peace conference, that's a win for Putin. We can't win for have Putin winning anything. We can't have NATO losing. We can't do it. We can't legitimize Putin. So no conference." So I doubt whether any such peace conference will take place.
Well, we'll continue to monitor that. And finally, then, and briefly, what are going to be the challenges for rebuilding Ukraine, both in terms of infrastructure and also societal healing?
I think it's going to be very, very difficult. There's a lot of it's a lot of destruction, so there's a lot of it's going to cost the enormous sums of money, but there's also it's a lot of casualties that have taken. Both sides have suffered huge numbers of deaths and life-altering injuries. I mean, it's like whatever however many were killed on either side, then you have to multiply that number by 2 or by 3 as to get to how many are now have permanent disabling injuries. They've lost arms, legs. They're in wheelchairs and so on. So it's like this is a huge cost. I mean, both Russia and Ukraine already had serious demographic problems. I mean, it's like there were not populations that were growing. So if you think about, I mean, Putin talked about this at his news conference, his annual news conference the other day. He said, "Well, true, we don't have enough births in our country. I think it's something like 1.4 children per woman, which is obviously far below the replacement rate." And they said, "Yeah, but that's still it's still par for the course if you compare us with the rest of Europe." And that's true. I mean, it's pretty much everywhere in Europe there isn't the replacement rate when it comes to births. But you've also suffered now these huge losses, which most of Europe hasn't suffered. So when you add all that together, that is going to be a serious demographic issue for Russia.
Huge, huge challenges. I will, Dr. George Szamuely, thank you as always for joining us. We will get you back to continue to unpack this. But for now, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.